Before we go into our interview today, I wanted to let everyone know we have a new sponsor for our Energy Question podcast, the U.S. Oil and Gas Association, or USOGA for short. First established in 1917, USOGA has been an effective and creative voice for the industry for more than a century now. USOGA is dedicated to educating the public, policymakers, and legislators at the federal, state, and local levels about the value of the domestic oil and natural gas industry. If you're in the industry and not currently a USOGA member, please consider joining the association as a way of helping it tell your story to the policymakers whose actions impact everything you do each and every day. You can start that process by contacting USOGA through its website, usoga.org. Thanks so much to USOGA for sponsoring the Energy Question podcast. And now on with our show.
Hey, welcome to the Energy Question with David Blackmon. I'm your host, David Blackmon, and my very special guest today is Meghan Lapp, who's the Fisheries Liaison with Seafreeze Shoreside, the largest producer of sea-frozen seafood on the U.S. East Coast. Meghan, how are you today?
I'm great, David. How are you?
Great, and I can't tell you how happy I am to have you with me today. I apologize that we had to delay this by a week. I just had a big problem pop up a week ago, but here we finally are. We're going to talk today, just so everyone knows, Meghan has a lot of insight on issues facing both the fishing industry, the commercial fishing industry along the East Coast, and the issue with more than 60 now dead whales turning up on seashores adjacent to the big offshore wind farms that are popping up all over the East Coast, thanks to the subsidization by the federal government and frankly, I think, lack of oversight, proper oversight by the Biden administration. But before we get into that, Meghan, take a couple of minutes to talk about yourself, your background, and the company as well.
Sure. So my name is Meghan Lapp. I have a master's degree in legal science, but I also built commercial fishing nets for almost 5 years in New Bedford, Massachusetts. I've worked for Seafreeze since 2015, and I am very highly involved in all of the regulatory aspects that affect our vessels. We have 5 commercial fishing vessels, 2 shoreside facilities. I'm the chair of the Herring Advisory Panel for the New England Fisheries Management Council and a member of their Habitat Advisory Panel. I'm a member of the Ecosystems and Ocean Planning Advisory Panel for the Mid-Atlantic Fisheries Management Council and their Squid Mackerel Butterfish Advisory Panel. And I'm the chair of the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission's Menhaden Advisory Panel. So I'm also a member of various offshore wind groups and initiatives. And you know, when I first started out working for Seafreeze, you know, my expectation was that my job was going to be focused primarily on commercial fishing regulations, as well as congressional legislation, Coast Guard legislation, stuff that happens in Washington that affects commercial fisheries, you know, policy, things like that. And while that is still a good portion of my job, as well as occasionally testifying to Congress on fisheries and ocean policy, offshore wind has really taken over. Unfortunately, because that is really the biggest threat to the continued existence of our business.
Yeah, I wrote a story about the fishing business and its difficulties with the wind industry at Forbes last fall. And of course, it's really developed by orders of magnitude since that time. Talk about, you know, I know looking at the Seafreeze website, they talk about how it's pretty difficult for the commercial fishing industry to coexist with these big wind projects. Talk about why that's the case in your view.
Well, it's not just my view, and I point that out a lot. You know, I have there are documents from overseas in Europe where wind farms exist that actually confirm a lot of the things that I presented, and as well as the radar issue, which I'll get into later. But basically, our commercial fishing vessels are trawl vessels. They have a net that is a quarter a mile to a half a mile behind the boat. It's spread open by steel hydrofoils called doors that open up the net. And that net swings back and forth in the tide and the currents, things like that behind the vessel. And you have to position the boat where you need it to be so you can get the net where you need it to be. You You have to avoid pre-existing hangs like rocks, shipwrecks, things like that. And if you were to attempt to operate that type of gear in a wind farm, where you have turbine bases with rocks and boulders and scour protection around them, you have cables that are buried at the beginning but become unburied over time in the sand, what can actually happen? And I have a depiction of this in picture form. It looks like a comic book strip from a Dutch UK government document that shows what happens if a trawler tries to fish in a wind farm. And it shows the fishing gear catching on cables and the boat sinking. So basically it's a safety issue. You cannot operate this kind of gear. You can't operate these boats in a wind farm. And the other issue is even transiting through a wind farm is not going to be a feasible option because offshore wind farms interfere with marine radar, which is an issue that I raised to the Coast Guard for years. I went to Coast Guard headquarters in 2018, spoke with the chief of the Office of Navigation Systems for the United States of America, and she had no idea that this was a problem. I asked the Coast Guard multiple times to do a modeling study of here's how many windmills that are being planned, this is the size of them, and model the radar interference so that we could have, you know, a rational conversation about what the impacts would be. And the Coast Guard refused to do that. And so over years and years of submitting comments, you know, studies, other documents from overseas to the Coast Guard, to BOEM, which is the federal agency that oversees offshore wind development. Finally, in 2022, the National Academy of Sciences came out with a study that said marine radar interference is interfered with by windmills. It's a huge problem. Confirmed and quoted all of the studies that I had already previously submitted to both the Coast Guard and BOEM, and said, yeah, this is a problem and we don't have any solutions. It's going to impact all classes of radar, and they offered, you know, avenues for further study. You know, they had suggestions for further study, but at this time, steel is going in the water as we are talking, and there are no solutions. So that's obviously a huge problem for my boats because we operate at night in inclement weather, in the fog, and radar are your eyes. And if it's not going to be reliable, then that puts you in a life-threatening situation.
Yeah, you know, and it's not just a problem in the Northeast. The Biden administration is getting ready to do a lease sale, offshore wind lease sale in the Western Gulf of Mexico, adjacent to Texas and Louisiana Gulf Coast. And of course, commercial fishing industry is huge in the Gulf of Mexico. So it's going to become a problem down here in the South as well. And this administration doesn't seem to have any any real concern about slowing this down. There is a principle in the regulatory arena for the federal government, and I'm trying to remember what it is, due caution principle, where if an issue has not been sufficiently studied and the science is not sufficiently fulsome about a particular issue, the government is supposed to slow the process down and wait for the proper science to be conducted. And it doesn't appear to me that this administration is interested in exercising any sort of due caution related to offshore wind, is it?
No, this administration has accelerated the process. I've asked multiple times. You know, I'm trying to engage in all of the regulatory aspects of fishing for, you know, for our vessels, and they've come out with multiple draft environmental impact statements on top of each other. And I'm like, they're thousands of pages long, each one.
Yeah.
You know, they're releasing them during Fisheries Management Council meetings. You know, we've asked them, please slow it down, don't do that. But they've made it very clear that their goal is to move the project forward. And I'll tell you something interesting, David, that I think you'll appreciate from a regulatory perspective, is the National Environmental Policy Act requires that, you know, for a major federal action that's going to impact the environment, they have to do an analysis, right? So what BOEM does for offshore wind, as opposed to the oil and gas process, where they start with a big area, they whittle it down to a lease area after they've gotten, you know, they've eliminated other parts of it because of various, you know, considerations. What they do with offshore wind is they lease the whole thing. They identify an area, they lease it. And when they lease it, they only do a brief analysis, and they say, oh, well, you know what? The only impact is really going to be putting a meteorological buoy out there to measure wind. That's not a big deal. Here's the lease. So what they do is they wait until the developer has created a construction plan, which in the meantime, that construction plan has been created to fulfill a power purchase agreement that the developer has already signed with some state utility on speculation. So when they submit their construction plan to BOEM, BOEM says, well, the purpose and need of our review of this is to fulfill the power purchase agreements, fulfill the state, renewable energy goals of whatever state the developer has contracted with, and to fulfill the administration's executive order about, tackling the climate crisis. And what they do in their actual analysis is they have created a screening process for what alternatives they will even consider to analyze. And those alternatives state that, well, we're not going to even consider anything that doesn't meet the goal of the developer, that doesn't meet the state's renewable energy goals, that doesn't meet the power purchase agreements, and doesn't meet the executive order. So what you actually get at the end is that the analysis, quote unquote, that the agency is conducting, it refuses to eliminate areas where there is heavy fishing or heavy vessel traffic, or to create a transit lane, or to say, hey, this part of the project or this project as a whole has too much environmental impact. Some of these areas they're citing on foraging grounds for critically endangered right whales. Some of them they're planning with open water cooling systems, which are illegal in the state waters that they're sending the power to, but then they're going to put it on a spawning ground of some sort and suck in all the eggs and larvae and kill it. So those kinds of environmental impacts, they won't even analyze not having that open ocean cooling system, and having a closed loop system, because that would not meet the goals of the developer and that would not meet all of these other things. So what you have is essentially a predetermined process from the day they issue the lease to the day the record of decision is issued, and it's very unfortunate.
Well, it's infuriating. I mean, you and I have very similar backgrounds. I did the same kind of work that you're doing, but I was in the oil and gas business, did that for years before I ended up in government affairs and working more on the legislative side. And, I know full well how these environmental impact study requirements and the regulatory restrictions have been for a long, long time very aggressively enforced on offshore oil and gas projects. Although there have been exceptions to that that have resulted in some pretty unfortunate events. But by and large, the enforcement of these regulations by BOEM, which is the offshore, the government agency that manages the offshore, I guess we should tell viewers, have been very aggressive related to oil and gas. But the impression I get, not being engaged in it like you are, is that there's simply very little actual enforcement of legal and regulatory requirements happening related to environmental and animal protections now, where the wind industry is concerned. Is that impression accurate, I guess, is my question here?
Yes, it is. And, BOEM has essentially jury-rigged its own process where even if they discover a major environmental impact, they won't act on it. They might say, hey, it is here in the analysis, but they won't act on it. And because of, their lack of compliance with federal law, their cavalierness and how they conduct this, we're actually the lead plaintiff on a lawsuit against Vineyard Wind, which is the first federally permitted large-scale offshore wind project. And that's being taken pro bono by the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And we're in court right now. The court process is not fast right now. They're actually constructing the project, and they started construction with knowledge that we were already engaged in a lawsuit. So we've asked the court for a motion for a stay of construction until the case is decided. We've had to appeal that, so that's kind of where we're at. But meanwhile, there's another project, South Fork Wind Farm, that's being constructed right now. National Marine Fisheries Service actually had written essential fish habitat reviews, which they're required to do by federal law, sent to BOEM and said, this project, as you're proposing it, will have population level impacts on Atlantic cod. BOEM didn't care. They approved it as was. And they did the same for just a few days ago for Revolution Wind, which is adjacent to the South Fork Wind Farm. So they're approving projects that are going to have population level impacts on marine species that are important for both commercial and recreational fisheries. And nothing is being done about this. And those are the kinds of environmental impacts, the commercial fishing industry would get shut down for that kind of an impact.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
There's no way we'd be allowed to have that kind of an impact, but yet it's okay, for an offshore wind farm company.
That is, and let's be honest about these wind farms that they're fast tracking into existence. They're not going to provide anything like the capacity that they advertise on their nameplate. They're going to run at about 10 to 20% efficiency and provide a tiny fraction of what they're advertising they'll provide. And they're not needed in any way, shape, or form, except for these states and for the United States to meet these arbitrarily set climate goals, right? So we can tick off the boxes that we built this much wind capacity and displaced this much coal or oil or natural gas fired electricity, right? I mean, that's really the only benefit to these I call them monstrosities, frankly.
Well, what's really interesting is in, for example, the Vineyard Wind documents, BOEM documents, they say the construction of offshore wind farms is not going to have any measurable impact on climate change. But yet that's their justification for approving these projects. Meanwhile, in some of the newer documents that I've seen, they say, well, it'll probably have, a beneficial impact because then it'll mean that, conventional fossil fuel plants will be retired. But that's not true.
Right. You're going to need to build more.
As you said, they only make, power for a very small percentage of the time, and the rest of the time, so that when people turn on their light switch, the light comes on, you will have to continue to run fossil fuel generated plants or nuclear plants if there are, nuclear plants. But usually from, what I have seen, the choice backup power for offshore wind is natural gas because it's quick firing.
Sure.
So to maintain the equilibrium on the grid, the natural gas plants, they're running all the time. They have to be staffed. They have to be, ready to rock and roll. It can't be like, well, let's turn it off. And then, oh no, the wind dropped out. Let's go turn it on now. That has to happen all the time. So the myth that, well, fossil fuel plants will be retired because it'll get replaced with offshore wind is exactly that. It's a myth. And I think what people also don't understand is, hey, guess what? Now you're paying two electric bills. You're paying for the wind farm and your taxes are paying for that. And you're paying for high, more expensive power. And you're still paying your conventional power bill because it has to be backed up. And
Right.
and that is something that people are really not being told as well. I don't think that the majority of the American public realizes what this would do to their electric bill.
And it's already doing it. I mean, utility bills in the state of Texas are up 15% this year so far, and they're going to keep going up. And we're one of the cheaper states in terms of power bills in the United States. Let's talk about the whales. I don't want to give the whales short shrift, and we do try to. If we go over time, that's fine. This is an important issue, but I do want to get a discussion of the whale issue in. Most people by now have seen the visuals, the tragic scenes of gray whales and right whales and other kinds of whales washing up on the coasts of Massachusetts and New York, New Jersey, adjacent to these giant wind farm operations. You recently offered congressional testimony. Was that at a field hearing on this issue?
I did offer testimony at a congressional field hearing on offshore wind. We did not discuss, I don't think we discussed the whale issue.
Didn't talk about the
meeting.
whale issue?
But I did testify on this issue at a legislative briefing.
Okay.
Not that long ago, for congressional staff. Yes.
Yeah. So what did you tell the staff when you talked to them, and how did they respond?
Well, I had some kickback from certain staff members. And so, I explained to them what's actually happening. Because, I got some questions from staffers and they said, well, seismic activity has been done with oil and gas development, and we've never seen this kind of, this number of whales wash up and things like that. So, how can you say that any of this is related? And so, what I had to explain is what we're actually seeing right now. There is a clear correlation. I can't say, well, this definitely caused this, right? However, if you start tracking the number of offshore wind survey days and the number of whale deaths, the lines coincide. And as you said, there's been, over 60 large whale deaths on the East Coast from December until now. And it's unprecedented. It's unheard of. These are not small whales. These are large baleen whales, mostly humpback whales, but there have been fin whales, which are endangered, sei whales, which are endangered. You have, there's been a couple, I believe, of right whales. There's been all these whales, minke whales, all of them large baleen whales. And that's an important point because when you look at the surveys are very, the seismic surveys that are done for offshore wind development, they're like largely unregulated. BOEM doesn't issue permits for these surveys. And what the surveys are doing is they're characterizing the seabed because they want to see what kind of sediment type there is before they pile drive, right? They want to see what's under there. So they're not going down as deep as oil and gas. They're going, several hundred meters into the seafloor. So it's not as intense as oil and gas, but here's the difference. In the Gulf of Mexico, you don't really have large baleen whales. There's like one species of them, which I think they just created a distinct population off of, and, it's limited in space. What you have on the East Coast is you have a migratory superhighway for multiple species of large baleen whales, thousands of whales every year that are migrating. It's like the I-95 corridor, but like, in the ocean, right, for whales. And so what you have happening is these surveys, they actually are required to get an incidental take authorization from NOAA.
Right.
Pursuant to the Marine Mammal Protection Act to conduct these surveys, because it is a type of seismic equipment. And if you read those incidental take authorizations, what they say is this. They say they expect temporary deafness to result from the surveys on the whales. Okay, now first off, if you're a whale, hearing is like your primary form of everything, right?
Yeah, it's how you live. Yeah.
Right. And where the surveys are happening is like at the entrance to the port of New York and New Jersey, literally one of the busiest ports in the world. And so a deaf whale is a dead whale. When that whale gets deafened, it can't get out of the way of a ship. It doesn't know a ship's coming. Boom. Right? So you have a superhighway of thousands of whales. They're getting blasted. And then you have all of these ships that are doing their regular thing. And so on top of that, when you read the incidental take authorizations, they're all different. And NOAA actually says in them, we don't know how much noise it takes to permanently deafen a large baleen whale. They said, we know that this is likely to cause temporary deafness, and we know that continued exposure to temporary deafness can lead to permanent deafness. And these surveys go 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But we don't really have any measurements on large baleen whales for that, okay? To the point of, and I did tell this to congressional staffers, some of them weren't too happy. I said, so you have hearing data on things like, dolphins and beluga whales, because they live in aquariums and you can test them. Nobody has a pet large baleen whale. Right? Like nobody has a pet humpback whale. So because of this, BOEM, the Marine Mammal Commission, and the US Navy have gone to Norway where they eat whales. And they're trying to conduct experiments on minke whales, which are a large baleen whale. And so what they're trying to do is herd them into fish pens, catch them, and then when they get them in there, put them up with a sling, put electrodes under their skin, blast them with noise and see what happens.
Oh my God.
So the environmental groups—
Wait, the US government is doing this?
Yes.
The US government is doing this in Norway.
Yes, and the Norwegian environmental groups have been up in arms about this. They did catch a couple. They didn't catch any the first year, I think. They caught a couple the second year. And then they did get one up in a sling, but it was shockingly, it was too distressed to do anything. And then eventually one of them got entangled in a rope in the fish pen and died from what I understand. So anyway, this has been the experiment. But the point is this: they know that they don't have hearing data on large baleen whales. So when you look at the incidental take authorizations that NOAA is issuing to offshore wind companies, they say, well, we expect that they're going to get temporarily deafened. We know that that can lead to permanent deafness. We really don't know how much sound causes that. But then they say, also, if you exceed the parameters of this permit, we can pull it. Well, they don't have anything to measure compliance by, because they don't even know how much noise it takes. But here's the other thing that I find interesting in those permits, because when you look at different ones, they have different estimates. So one of them that I read said, well, the noise, the impact zone from this seismic equipment extends 141 meters past the equipment. Another one said 178 meters. But the shutdown zone, if they see a whale, is only 100 meters. So you could have a whale that's within the actual parameters of what they're saying is the impact zone, but they're not required to shut down. For right whales, it's 500 meters. For all other whales, it's 100 meters. So when you actually look at this, you go, this is not there's something obviously seriously wrong here. And because of that, there were 30 mayors, coastal mayors from New Jersey that called for a moratorium. And they said, hey, whoa, we need to really look at this and see what's going on.
And this is where the principle of due caution would kick in. And if this was an oil and gas project, it would be halted while the government studied the issue, right? But this is a preferred industry. And so the Biden administration is just trying to ignore it and get past it.
Yeah, what's amazing to me is, NOAA will send spokespersons out and they will say, oh, well, there's definitely no connection, definitely no connection. And I'm like, you're issuing incidental take authorizations for these. And it says this, how can you make that statement? Because again, none of this has ever been witnessed before. And I'll tell you this story. A few weeks ago, I was at a Mid-Atlantic Fisheries Management Council meeting, and I got a text message from a commercial fisherman who was out at sea, and he was like, here's another dead whale. So I said, well, where are you? What are your coordinates? And he told me he was south of Fire Island, New York. Meanwhile, then I'm looking at a Coast Guard local notice to mariners that's showing that a survey vessel for Vineyard Wind Mid-Atlantic was surveying in the area at that time. So then I go on live marine traffic and I see that the boat just got there a day or two prior and is working in the area right near this floating dead whale. So that whale lands on shore the next day at Smith Point. 2 days later, another whale washes up. I think that one was Long Branch, New Jersey. Then a couple days later, another one washes up at Atlantic Beach, New York, all within just around these areas where the survey was going on. And you can see, here comes the boat, it starts surveying. Within 1 week, 3 dead whales. And you're like, the coincidence here, in timing of surveys and timing of whale deaths and the geographic location of this, the only thing that has changed is the surveys, right?
Yeah.
Nothing else has changed in the ocean. Nothing else.
That's the key point here. That's the variable that has changed.
Right.
And that's when all the whales started washing up.
Right.
This was not a big issue before that.
No. And the New York Times did a piece where when all this started to go down and people in New Jersey were angry, they were losing their minds. The New York Times did a piece and they said, well, it's really because of online shopping. They said it's making more ship traffic. But if you actually look at the link that they had put in the article of numbers of ships, that the time like the period of time that they looked at, the number of ships had decreased, not increased. The only thing that had changed was the offshore wind farm surveys. And like I said, you know, every action that is taken that has an environmental impact, right? The impact that it has is going to be determined by the environment that it's being taken in, right? So, you know, you don't go hunt moose in Arizona. You hunt moose in Alaska or Maine, right? And so if you were to do, you know, this type of activity in a different environment, it wouldn't have the same impacts as when you're doing it in a whale superhighway.
Yeah.
That also happens to be a heavy, you know, shipping traffic area. And that's,
Right.
you know, when you start to look at it and you just put 2 and 2 together and you see logically what's happening, you see, oh, the survey boats go out, now whales are washing up. You know, and as survey days increase, the number of dead whales increase. You would really think, as you said, that somebody would start talking about the precautionary principle. We in the fishing industry, you know, live and die by the precautionary principle.
Thank you. Thank you for getting the terminology right. It's been a while since I did that work. I knew I wasn't using the right term there.
I'm very, very familiar with that word.
Yeah. You know, and I didn't honestly, and we're running up against time, but I have to say, I didn't think it was even possible for me to be even more disgusted about all of this related to the wind industry than I already was. But after talking to you, I really truly am even more disgusted that we're doing this. Not just to whales, but you know, in Texas, we're like a superhighway. Our Gulf Coast is a superhighway for migratory birds. And we have all these needless, unnecessary, completely unnecessary wind projects going up along the Gulf Coast in South Texas. They're just decimating our migratory bird populations right now. And I just think about, well, now they're going to put them offshore and do even more damage and create even more carnage for no reason. We don't need any more wind power in Texas. We have, my gosh, we have more than almost the rest of the country combined here. So it's crazy to me. All of it is insane. And I can't thank you enough for taking the time to do this with me today. And would like to make this a recurring theme on my podcast and catch up with you again periodically when we reach certain inflection points in the future.
That would be great. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to bring as much attention to this as I can. And I just, I'm just, it's heartbreaking. The story about what they're doing to the whales in Norway is just heartbreaking. These are incredibly intelligent animals. It's really inhuman. It's like these stories about all the scientific, the medical experimentation on beagles that came to light during the COVID pandemic. Really heartbreaking stuff. Meghan, we're going to have to wrap this up now. But how can our viewers get in touch with you and keep up with your activities? Where can they find you in social media and places like that?
Well, I am on Facebook. I refuse to have any of the rest of them because I don't have time to keep up with it.
Yeah,
I'll be honest. But my Facebook page just basically is offshore wind, offshore wind related things. And people can also get a hold of me through the Seafreeze website.
Okay, good deal. Well, thank you so much. I wish you the best of luck in what you're doing and look forward to talking to you again in the future.
Thank you very much, David. I appreciate it.
And thank you to the Sandstone Group for producing our show, our extraordinary producer, Eric Perel, and our sponsor, the U.S. Oil and Gas Association. Thank you to everyone involved. This is David Blackmon, and that's all for now.